Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll make a start. There's still a few people coming in, so I want to keep the time. Thank you for joining us. I'm Paul Unger, editor of Place Northwest. Can you hear me all right at the back? I don't know if the mics are
a bit louder.
A bit louder. Are these? Is there somebody? No?
No.
Right. Okay, I'll stand up to help things. Thanks for coming along to this housing session of the afternoon ones. Do you need me to?
Nice to the back.
We've had a slight change to the advertised schedule in that Ivan Lewis MP has had to go off to something else and won't be taking part in this session. Hopefully you were there for the earlier session and saw him give his passionate address around education policy there. Joining us for this session, we've got Charlotte Harrison from the Northern Housing Consortium and Mark Henderson from Home Group and Ed Douglas from ResPublica. So I don't know, a quick show of hands, how many have had a chance to have a look at the housing recommendations from the Manifesto for the North that was published today? Or would it help if I rattled through a few of the recommendations in there just in a nutshell, and then it seems only fair to explore some of those today. Pan-regional regeneration partnerships to lead housing development, flexibility around affordable housing and starter home targets to kickstart regeneration, allow retention of stamp duty land tax receipts and the new stamp duty receipts on buy-to-let, and to fund more building and private rented sector funds. So a few things to think about there, and we're looking for innovative ideas and questions around those, and forward-looking, not going over old ground. Please do come in and take a seat. I'm just starting. Okay, we'll wait for one more and then we shall make a start. So the format, we're going to have initial statements from the panel members, sort of 3 to 5 minutes each, and then we'll go into a Q&A. I'll ask a few questions and then open it out to the floor. So do you want to get us underway?
Yeah, thank you.
Charlotte.
Well, firstly, thanks very much for coming. I'm Charlotte Harrison from the Northern Housing Consortium. For those that don't know us, we're a membership body representing social housing providers and local government across the north of England, so the North East, North West and Yorkshire and Humber. And we were really pleased that ResPublica have got a section in their manifesto for the North on housing, and that they wanted to have a session on housing today. The Consortium for the last 6-9 months has been running a commission for housing in the North, and we gathered together 16 of the great and the good, including peers, academics, practitioners, financiers, to really think about, in essence, we set a core question, which was, what do housing markets across the North need to look like, and how do they best operate for us to support a vibrant northern powerhouse? And for us, we've been talking to our members, other stakeholders, and crucially, I think, people that perhaps in the housing sector we haven't heard from before, across business, to understand what they expect and want from housing in the North. And some of the issues that have been very strong in coming through is that it's increasingly evident for business leaders that they see housing as part of infrastructure. They see housing as having a very definite and direct relationship with productivity, that where we've got areas like Manchester that are booming and doing really well, yes, we need to invest in those areas to support growth. But there are some areas of perhaps parts of the North where poor quality housing or housing in the wrong place actually has the potential to act as a brake on productivity, and we need to equally concentrate on how do we resolve and fix some of those housing markets. And throughout the work of the Commission, we've been exploring what tools and approaches we could take to do that. there's lots of opportunities, and we've just published an interim report, which I've got a few copies of, but not as many for people in the room, I'm afraid, but I can point you in the direction of our website. What we heard from the finance and institutional investors was that there's absolutely latent appetite to invest in the north. There's not a geographical issue about putting off investment, but what those investors are looking for are clear, strong economic visions for housing and for their local economies, places to be agile, to have swift approaches to supply sites and to be able to build out at pace. And they really want leadership, and leadership that doesn't disconnect between what a leader's vision for an area might be and how, for example, the planning committee might operate within a local authority. We also think there's huge opportunities around home ownership in the north. When you look across the country, there's a lot of room to go at to promote home ownership in the north. But we would caution government to think more creatively and to work with northern housing providers to come up with new approaches to home ownership. And something we think that they've perhaps missed a bit of a trick on at the moment is investing more in the rent-to-buy model. They've put a lot of money behind shared ownership, but we think there are other approaches. There are a couple of points that have already been made today that I'd just also like to touch upon in some of the challenges that I think we face. One, I think, is regeneration. We spent quite a bit of time in the Commission to date thinking about how do we reposition a regeneration debate so it captures both government imagination but also supports communities. And if that was important a month ago, I think it's even more important today. And as we've heard from several, in fact, if not all of the speakers this morning, when you look at the vote for Brexit, it's clear that there are parts of the north that, as we mentioned, that feel that they've been left behind. And we think that in this Parliament, I think regeneration has had quite a narrow focus on estate-based regeneration, and it is absolutely the time to think about not just what does the Northern Powerhouse do in Manchester, but does the Northern Powerhouse mean anything for Hartlepool? And if we can't make it work for Hartlepool, then what else can we do, and how can we resolve that? And I see Mr Stacey's in the audience as well in this session, and I just wanted to pick up on, I think, his really valid point earlier about, in terms of devolution, I think housing absolutely has to be part of that devolution agenda. Now, whether it's the sector or whether it's how some of the devolution deals go, when you go back through the mists of time first to city deals, housing didn't really feature, and so we were left playing catch up in city deals and growth deals. I think we're in a much better position in the rounds of devolution deals, and with each iteration, and as Greg Clark said, you know, it's a process of continual devolution now. We're starting to see perhaps more nuanced approaches to housing devolution work. Up until now, I think there has been a focus on things like land commissions, housing investment funds, and they have their place. But we absolutely agree with Tony's point earlier that there is an opportunity, and we should be thinking creatively and collaboratively about how can we devolve housing and housing-related policy within devolution deals so that we can use policy levers to either incentivise behaviours in the marketplace or to shape housing markets that work in the best manner for those local economies. And I know I tweeted to Tony that particularly the Lancashire devolution deal, which is still going through, is exploring how they perhaps could use some policy levers in different ways. And we really hope that through the work of the Commission and through colleagues such as Mark and the work he's doing with the Homes for the North group, that we can start to come forward with some really exciting ideas about not just using funds differently, but actually shaping housing policy that works for the North.
Thank you very much. Mark, next.
Okay, Paul, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Paul introduced me as coming with a home group hat on today, but I guess my comments are really with my hat on as Chair of Homes for the North. So Homes for the North, that brings together 20 largest developing housing associations in the north of England. So collectively, we've got about 500,000 homes under our ownership and management. That's 1 in 3 of all social housing in the north of England. We build about 16,000 homes over the next couple of years, and we employ 20,000 people people in the north of England. So we collectively do our bit, but we want to do much, much more for the north of England, and that's why we've come together. I think that starts with starting to influence what we have in terms of a national housing policy, which is a one-size-fits-all national housing policy, and by and large that size is London. Now, yes, London absolutely has a housing crisis. London absolutely needs a policy and governmental response to that housing crisis. But it's different from the housing crisis in the north, and we do have, I'd argue, a housing crisis in the north that can actually destabilise and really kind of put a real brake on the growth and opportunities that exist in the north, because our crisis is about having the wrong type, the wrong quality, the wrong tenure in the wrong location of housing, rather than just a numbers game, which is very much the case in London. So how do we create a sort of, a 21st century housing for a 21st century economy in the north? I'm just going to throw 5 things at you. If only housing was so easy as you could just do 5 things and that would be it fixed. There's a gazillion, but I'll throw kind of 5 ranging from small to large things that Homes for the North are actively working on to take forward. The first one of those is about actually freeing up economic mobility for a customer base across the north of England. Frankly, the way that nominations and allocations agreements work on a local by local authority basis really do actually prevent people from moving in pursuit of employment across the north of England. So I think one of the things that we can do, cost-free, easy to do, easy to sort, is actually have a pan-northern allocation system right across the north of England to allow people to follow their economic opportunities as they come, rather than preventing them from being able to do so. Point 1. Point 2, I think we need to kind of almost disrupt the housing market, or certainly free some of that up. We look at quite a lot of models, and particularly led by the government at the moment, and I agree, about promoting home ownership in this country, but very often that is tied to new housing product, so building more homes for people to own. We miss a trick there. Right to buy, or the voluntary right to buy, will bring some existing customers into fulfilling their aspirations and owning their own home, but it's a relatively small number in the grand scheme of things. Perhaps even with, exactly as it is with local authorities, perhaps only 10% of our customers will buy their own home under the voluntary right to buy scheme. Actually, the aspiration is much greater. Within Home Group, we've got 55,000 homes. 86% of our customers want to buy their own home. So I think we need across the north to find new ways for people to fulfil their aspirations to own their own homes, whether that's rent to buy, whether that's by working with the Help to Buy ISA, whether that's actually having a more northern bespoke product to help people then buy their own homes, to actually then start to free up that market dynamic, because that receipt goes back into a new programme of house building. People have more skin in the game and more care for the communities they operate in. So point 3. Number 4, I think we need to look at new types of tenure, housing tenure, new models of tenure across the north. The models of tenure across this country are very traditional and very staid. London can kind of work with that because it's got that kind of absolute density and that absolute kind of realm of choice. So you can kind of invent, almost in a sub-market or illegal subletting market, new kinds of tenancy. That doesn't exist in the north. I use an example. What about graduates? I use from my own experience, desperately trying to punt my own 2 kids now they've graduated out of the house. Please don't come back. But there is not. I don't mean that. Well, I do mean that. Yeah, please don't come back. What a bloody mess they make. But we need to find new kinds of tenures, particularly for graduates. You know, there's a real brain drain. It's something that Homes for the North are now doing some active work on. There is a real brain drain for the North. The housing offer is a part of that. Yes, employment opportunities is a part of that. But there are very little opportunities. If you think what's open for a graduate in the north of this country is either, a flat, to purchase a flat, buy an executive 2-bed bungalow in an executive estate, or stay in something akin to their old student flat. There isn't that mid-market tenure that London can offer, but also it's starting to happen in North American cities in particular, bespoke, targeted at retention of new graduates. So watch out for some work we'll be doing with Homes for the North. I think the other bit, I very much agree with what the ResPublica publication today. I think it's about to encourage more development and more investment in housing development across the north. We can do that by reducing risk and increasing certainty for those who are going to invest and to develop new homes. I think we need a housing plan for the north, pan-local authorities, where we mix in development agreements. So we bring in high-value and low-value sites. We recycle receipts. So we can create certainty for investors by creating that pipeline of development, not 30 houses here and maybe another 100 there when the planning permission comes through. But mixing that together, pan-northern, to create long-term opportunities for investment and to recycle receipts, to bring lower value sites tied to infrastructure, which I'll come to in a second, to actually stimulate genuine new boom in house building across the north. The fifth and final one that I'd propose is actually joining up national and local policy and actually starting now, yes, have a housing policy for the north, but it needs to be linked to infrastructure planning. It's a huge frustration, I think, for all of us in housing, where we see an infrastructure plan for the north and it doesn't even mention housing. There is a hugely lost opportunity. We're talking about Transpennine Railway, the logistics corridor between Hull and Liverpool. Brilliant opportunities. If we tied housing to those kind of infrastructure plans and economic growth plans, we in the north could really start, I think, to generate some excitement. We could genuinely start to boost housing supply and create new housing markets across the north. I think those five, together with lots of other things that we need to do, are entirely doable. All of those actually in themselves are cost-free. They are entirely doable for a confident and a creative north. But integral to that is we need to take housing seriously as an integral part of the economic growth and future for the north of England. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Edward from ResPublica.
Great. Yeah, so kind of following on, I guess, from what Mark said, I think we absolutely have to kind of just take a step back here and see why housing is important to the Northern Powerhouse project. If you look at the EY Attractiveness Survey, they do it every year. Cost of living and quality of life, really big factors in a business's decision to invest in a particular area or city. Housing is absolutely central to those two things. So if the north is to grow, then we've got to make sure that housing is a central part of the Northern Powerhouse agenda. We have to start thinking what is it that central government can do to deliver the homes the north needs across all different tenure types. The problem is actually that when we talk about the housing crisis, we think it's not really a northern problem, but actually house building has slowed in the north by 28% in the last decade. And our estimate is that for the 5 major cities in the north, there'll be a housing shortage of 86,000 by 2030. On top of that, Resolution Foundation last week had an interesting report out on housing costs to income that showed that in the northwest, housing cost to income is only 2% lower than it is in the southeast. So the gap between the north and south, particularly in the high growth parts of the north, isn't as big as we think. And what does that mean? That means that the potential for the Northern Powerhouse to be realised and for northern cities to grow is going to just be held back. So what we need to do, I think, is in places like Manchester, we can't just see house price growth and foreign investment in property as the sign of economic growth in the city and the region as a whole. And we need to ensure that the Northern Powerhouse agenda gives cities the tools they need to deliver housing. I mean, I guess the first thing that you can do is to look at transport. So if you can link up areas where you have empty properties and there's need for regeneration better with sources of employment, then you can start to make sure that people have places to live and that prosperity is spread across the north rather than be focused in city centres. And that's absolutely central. I mean, it's not just intercity links, it's not just HS2, it's making sure that we have the right bus services and cities have power over trains, trams, and all that kind of thing. And then I think we need to look at what other kind of tools we can have. So in our manifesto today, we've set out some options for stamp duty retention. And just as an example of the kinds of things that could do, on our estimates, if we had local retention of stamp duty, it could fund, of that 86,000 gap, we could fund 53,000 homes. But it could be used in innovative ways. It could get sites ready for development. It could be used to unlock public land. It could be used for land assembly. There are lots of different options. And the reason that we focused on the buy-to-let levy as well is that it could be used as seed funding to attract institutional investment to start to deliver the kinds of homes that can help retain young graduates and people with startups in the cities, because that's a big part of what the north needs. When you look at business creation rates in the north, we need that to grow massively if economic growth is to be realised. So those are some options. Obviously, I completely echo what Charlotte and Mark said about the need for housing policy powers to be properly devolved as well, so that as the North grows, there are the powers locally to meet that need. But yeah, and that covers my thoughts.
Okay. Taking the recommendations from the manifesto published today, which you've sort of alluded to there, Mark, on the need for a housing plan for the North, and the first recommendation talks about creation of a pan-regional regeneration partnership to lead housing development. Such a body would enjoy access to pooled devolved powers and have control over financing and land, protected from call-in by Secretary of State, and be funded through the uplift in land value, planning gain. Couldn't you say, well, that's just another quango? It'll take 2 years to bring in a consultation, then it'd have to be set up, and there'd be, you know, a delay, more bureaucracy, more consultants' fees, and branding and launching and all the rest of it, and we just need to get on with the tools at our disposal at the moment.
I think that's a challenge you could throw at it. I think nonetheless we are limited by sense of scale at the moment in terms of starting to create that joined up sense across the North. While we have devolution across the North, it is defined by relatively tight boundaries, and if you look in the grand scheme of things on a global scale, Manchester on its own, or Greater Manchester on its own, is relatively small in that kind of context. So I think there's definitely something about the North. I was very taken with, I kind of looked at, you look at the growth of Silicon Valley starting from PCB manufacturing in Santa Clara. If you do the impacts of that across California, transpose that onto graphene technology in Manchester, it touches Newcastle. The impact of this kind of stuff, if we do it right, if we do it properly, needs to be considered on a pan-regional or a pan-local authority basis. So I think we need to have something. I care less, I guess, for the style or the nature of the bureaucracy that does it. There's plenty of bits of legislation out there, whether it's a UDC type approach that's still kind of potential to create those things exists. I think what it does need, though, is maturity. It needs people to understand where each place has its benefit, so we don't all have, we'll have one each of those, which has been the case in the past. And certainly my experience of working in the RDA was that if the North East RDA had one, well, Yorkshire Forward would have one too, and then Manchester would have one, and then everybody would have one. We need that maturity, and something that is pan-regional that brings that maturity, irrespective of the structure, I think is really, really important, because on our own, yes, we can have real focus, we can make a difference to our communities, but we can make that much greater by doing that on behalf of the North of England.
Okay. Charlotte, anything to add on the pan-regional regeneration partnership idea?
I mean, I think, at the risk of consensus breaking out all over the place, I think I do agree with Mark that we actually looked at trying to promote that idea. You can tell how old ago this was because it was in some work that was commissioned that we did, that was commissioned by the Housing Corporation, and we were looking at how you might take land value uplift and move it across the North. Perhaps with combined authorities starting to think about how they might pool receipts and share receipts, you're starting to see the embryonic elements of that moving. I think perhaps from a local authority point of view, some of our members say that the duty to cooperate perhaps isn't as embedded and mature as perhaps it needs to be in the future, and that might be one of the catalysts that we need to get over. But certainly as a principle, I think it's absolutely on the right lines.
Any initial thoughts from the audience as to, lady at the front first?
I think,
Just
sorry,
speak up, yeah.
From CPRE Lancashire again. I mentioned this morning about using brownfield land, because it seems that there's a problem with the way the private sector functions. In Greater Manchester alone, there are planning permission for 47,000 houses. That was a figure quoted from Sue Derbyshire, who used to be the lead for planning across Greater Manchester. Maybe there's a role for the public sector in actual delivering houses, because it seems to me, well, it seems to our organisation that there's a stoppage in the pipeline where housing developers seek and gain permissions but don't actually have building houses as their end goal. They just want the land value increase from the land game planning permission. So I think it's a great idea to get some mechanism to lock in value to be spent by partnership generation.
Okay, there's another hand in the middle and then behind. Yeah, with the glasses.
Jeff Green from Wirral, non-exec director of Magenta Living. My concern, a couple of things that were said, was the sort of democratic deficit. We've been talking about local communities, and we've been talking about how we connect with them and listen. And yet, from my political experience, the committee that you get the most attendance, the most activism is the planning committee. And so, for us to say, I think it was suggested that the leader of the council should have the planning committee should be a creature of the leader of the council, and that I think in the manifesto for the North it's saying they should remove the ability for the Secretary of State to call in a particular capricious decision one way or another. It does seem to be somewhat at odds with what we've been talking about a little bit earlier about empowering local communities and letting local communities have a say around their environment and what's built where and so on. So it does seem a bit disconnected. It might be great for us as wanting to build houses, don't get me wrong, but in terms of does that actually help the local community?
Okay, and the gentleman sitting behind.
Ian Williams from THFC. Now, I think a lot of what you say is very commendable. I heard what has happened in the last 2 weeks, described yesterday as the economy just suffered a heart attack. I wonder if the patient has had a heart attack, does that revise your view of how you do things in the Northern Powerhouse? And we've got most volume house builders are off about 35–40%. I'm not sure they're going to be doing a lot of building anywhere.
Okay, we'll take them in order. Some thoughts around delivery, brownfield. Should we give consents just to those that are going to deliver and got a track record? Any thoughts across the panel? Yep.
Yeah, sure. I mean, on brownfields and land assembly, I think one of the problems is that we've got this kind of pent-up demand for new sites and housing, and then it kind of gets strangled by the system that is unable to deal with it. So that pops out odd decisions in terms of planning committees and odd locations for land as a result, because people just go wherever they can get consent for. So I think actually the pan-regional thing, to start looking at what is the genuine need for land and then starting to assemble land. And I think something that we can start to do within whatever democratic structure we have is to use CPO powers, compulsory purchase order powers, far more effectively than we do. You know, being a local authority chief exec, you go into the legal team and mention the word CPO and it vacates. Yeah, they go white and run because it's bloody hard to do and particularly skilled. You know, we've actually got this thing called the HCA where a lot of that skill actually sits within. So you could see a real brilliant function for the Homes and Communities Agency to sit alongside whatever it is on a pan-regional basis, which starts to identify the land that's actually required and to then use those CPO powers to properly assemble the right kind of land in the right places, without being held to ransom by a rocky for if you're a private developer, or by little ransom strips of land that kind of bugger up the kind of proper assembly and the proper development of land across the north of England. So I think there's a real brownfield, yes, but actually CPO powers to me are the much more important thing in land assembly.
How does that fit with the austerity era? Hiring a whole load of QCs on £10,000 an hour is not going to go down well with the disaffected, excluded voters that want to see change, is it?
Okay, so I think you need to say, let me come on to the democratic bit, because I think you've got to see all of this in the round. I've been a former chairman of the Planning and Development Control Committee. I know exactly what you mean. It was only when Scotland were in those days when we did play international football that the committee was less than 5 minutes time. Probably a good way of circumventing democracy, isn't it? Have a half-decent Scottish football team will never happen, sadly. No, I think one of the things that we can use, and this kind of sense of devolution, is it seems to me that what we're highlighting is there's a real sense for proper engagement at the right time, no matter which policy we're talking about, but rather than after the event, at the right time. So I think a new way of planning and a new way of engaging communities and how we actually start to plan housing development, economic development, infrastructure development across the north is needed. It seems to me that by the time it gets to planning committee, it's way too late. It's either yes or no, have your fight, and then spit out a consent or a refusal notice. If we're able to do this at scale, there's a chance, I think, to have a much more meaningful discussion about where we should start allocating land across the north of England and look at it from a north of England perspective. Again, far too often it's done on, it's the site at the back of my house and I'll have a fight about that because of the proximity issue. I think if you look pan-northern, you have a very different kind of debate, much more informed debate and much more engaged debate at the right time rather than trying to fix a problem that you've already created.
I think one of the things that I've been trying to upload onto Twitter, but I failed miserably, so I'll try and do it before the end of the day, is we've looked at some graphs, we've pulled together some graphs looking at unimplemented planning permissions using the LGA figures, but we've taken them to a northern level. And actually, I'll shortcut it, for the green and sort of yellow areas are actually doing okay, and for the most part the north is in green and yellow when you get a chance to see these brilliant graphs that you'll see later. There are some hotspots which are showing higher levels of unimplemented planning permissions, but then again I think we've also started to see, and we've had examples of this through the Commission, where local authorities are looking at how they might themselves put resources in to unlock those stalled sites. Wakefield, for example, had identified a considerable number of units that weren't moving forward, or housing units that weren't moving forward because they were on stored land. And they put an officer in to actually work with those individual landowners to understand what the barrier was. And sometimes it was about a lack of understanding of some of the investment programmes. Mark mentioned the HCA. I think for those of us who are practitioners in the room, sometimes getting your way through HCA funding programmes is a job in itself, and if you're not sort of used to that, if you're a landowner that hasn't got that expertise. So Wakefield have tried to unlock stalled processes through that way, and absolutely agree with what Mark said, that if you can take that experience, and we're hopefully doing this through some work we're doing on unlocking development and delivery, and then bring that scale. So if Wakefield are able to do that, if you multiply that across the Leeds City region, how much more land does that unlock straight away? Within land, we also hear from our members that sometimes there's a bit of a public sector, colleagues across the public sector are not always as forthcoming as they might be about releasing their surplus public sector land, and I think it is important we do link that back to infrastructure. And the Northern Independent Economic Review, as Mark said, had hardly any mention of housing in it. It did, but there were a couple of mentions, and I suppose the only positive I take from that is I think there were slightly more mentions of it in the Economic Review than there was of housing in the Marmot Review, and yet housing and health has really come on a lot. So maybe we're at the start of a positive journey about housing and infrastructure, and land release being key to that.
And yeah, just to add to that on the brownfield land. I mean, the question there, it's not a northern issue; it's a countrywide issue. Why is the public sector not engaging more in releasing more land? It's all there for them. Why is it not happening? What's the blockage? And I think essentially that's an issue of capacity in bodies like the NHS, particularly at the local level, and in local authorities on estate management. And I think people just need to be forward-looking and come up with kind of joint ventures that can support better public service delivery, but also release land for development. And then you can start to think about, land for supported housing, sheltered housing, etc. So yeah, I think that's a good point, but I'm not sure it's necessarily a northern issue. And then yeah, on our kind of pan-regional development corporation idea and how does it involve communities, I think that's a really important question. I think we do need to rethink how communities are engaged with, and it's an opportunity to do that. It's giving people the power to do it away from Whitehall, and we need to think about how communities, business, local authorities can come together and lead development, and how communities can have a say over it. I think that's an open question. I think we need to think about the way that communities are engaged in their built environment and how housing is delivered. That's a big question.
Okay, and any other thoughts on that democratic deficit, and is it anti-localism to bypass call in and put things up for public inquiry and scrutiny in front of an inspector and the approval process by Secretary of State? Any thoughts either way on that along the panel?
Well, I mean, as I say, I think it's absolutely about looking at the ways that communities can proactively engage in the planning process rather than be this kind of adversarial system where you kind of come forward with a plan and you encourage criticism of it. So I think this is an opportunity to genuinely engage communities from the outset of big regeneration projects. I mean, it's always going to be difficult, but there are lots of different ways we could look at doing that.
And I think Mark was right in this point about if that starts at planning committee, it's too late. And certainly we've been able to demonstrate to government where our members, housing providers, have got relatively controversial housing developments through planning in super quick time because they've put the time and investment in up front in working with communities and also and thinking creatively about how they do that. So not just engaging with the people directly affected, but perhaps taking plans about possible future developments out to local supermarkets to talk to the wider community who might see those housing developments as opportunities. And certainly we had CLG up on a recent visit, and we were able to show them a scheme in York which on the face of it should have been quite a tricky one to get through, but actually the housing provider and the council were really pleased with how easy it was to secure planning permission because the legwork had been done up front. And I take your point about, I wasn't hopefully suggesting that planning committee should be a slave to the leader, but I think, again, there are examples that we've seen where chief executives and leaders have taken the view of housing development being part of an inward investment programme and wanting to show that they're open for business. That's not to negate the need for absolutely critical democratic input, but the institutional investors were saying that's what they want to have. They want to have that strong economic vision portrayed to them that then builds their confidence about investing in an area. Okay, and the third of those three questions around how does Brexit affect the plan, presuming this manifesto was written largely before the referendum, thinking about residential values, thinking about funding streams, thinking about the ministerial support, Brandon Lewis, Greg Clark, George Osborne. Presumably there'd be a new government by the end of the year, there'd be a reshuffle, those people might be in completely different departments, nothing to do with any of this placemaking and housing. There are lots of factors that could be affected, aren't there?
Yeah, I'll pick that one up. And I guess what do we do post Brexit? Haven't a clue. Is my honest answer. I don't know what the impact is. Yeah. And I don't know what's going to happen either. What I see at the moment are very peculiar kind of just quirks and volatilities in the market. So, for instance, what I'm seeing in Kent is a huge boom in confidence in house purchase at the moment, and it seems to correlate to those areas that were more strongly leave are now kind of they're bouncing, if you like, in terms of confidence. That can only be a very, very short-term effect, clearly. So you're just going to get a lot of this stuff, I guess, over the next short term. I think the more serious point is about planning for more significant variations and potentially, say, a property decline or a housing decline over the short to medium term in this country. And I think there are things, and I do hear, and I'm comforted to hear government talking about things. So what can housing associations do? Well, in the past, certainly we could be a very strong and force for good in terms of we're counter-cyclical, in terms of our construction programmes. We're building for rent, we're not building for sale, we're not taking the risk on the sale value of a property. The housing programme is flipped very much to for sale now, but I'm quite heartened to hear government now starting to say, well, if we do see a property decline, we'll flip that back. We'll not be so impressed about tenure, but we can flip that back to an affordable rented product, because we will keep construction, we'll keep the construction sector busy, we'll keep building houses, in time of bust in this country, and it's what housing associations did incredibly effectively 7 or 8 years ago during the property decline. And I think it needs that kind of pragmatic view from governments, and they've got governments and potential government have all got a lot on their plate just now, but it is good to hear people like Brandon Lewis and Greg Clark openly talking in a pragmatic way about what they can do to assist. But at this stage, way too early to actually say what the real impact is going to be. We all have our glasses half full or half empty. I don't know where mine is, if I'm absolutely honest.
To add to that, I think that's kind of why it's so important that we do one of our recommendations, which is to give more flexibility locally on affordable housing targets, on tenant type, because then cities, local authorities are able to respond to the uncertainty and changes in the market. The other thing I would just raise is that obviously there's a lot of uncertainty around single market, freedom of movement. If that has a direct impact on the supply of construction workers, then it's going to raise build costs, it's going to slow down development, and we've got to now think about having a proper skill system in place for people so that they can move into the construction industry, because we're not doing it at the moment.
I think the other sort of non-development aspect of post-Brexit is certainly when we were engaging with our members before the vote, one of the fears that several of them raised was potential risk to community cohesion. And across the north, I think there's a very strong role and evidence that housing providers play a very important role as community anchors within their localities. And certainly in conversations we've had, members are looking again at how are they alert to perhaps murmurings or rumblings of community cohesion issues. I think we've all seen the national figures on hate crime being apparently reported. No one's entirely as increases, whether that's an immediate spike and it will settle down, or whether that's the start of perhaps a longer period of discontent as Brexit possibly unwinds itself. But I do think, aside from the role of developers and being able to sort of step into the breach, there is also that community focus that housing organisations can and will play.
Okay, we'll take 2 or 3 more, or any, on the front, then the red, then the back. Okay,
Simon Chisholm from Residents. Just on this point of community involvement in housing and also community cohesion, I just wanted to make reference to community land trusts. Obviously delivering very small scale housing solutions, so therefore in terms of the total housing, never the whole solution, but I think in our view an extremely important contribution, because it puts in the hands of the local community, not just to say, but actually potentially the development and ownership of that, and stewardship of that asset for local need, and a closer focus on what that need really is, and when it comes to planning, a greater consensus over what the local community sees as the benefits of that development. So I think that should be an important part of the mix.
Okay, right in the middle.
Hannah David, Planning Futures think tank. Just a couple of points that I wanted to make. Firstly, obviously consultation with communities for planning applications at the beginning stages is obviously very important to get buy-in. To me, it's very obvious that that's what we need to do. But there's another issue of the training of councillors and the understanding by councillors of the decisions that they're making. For example, understanding what their local plans say about the provision of housing within their area. From my experience working with planning committees, many councillors will go through a local plan in their full council meeting, but not would have read it or understood the nuances and the actual provision of housing needs contained within that plan. The second one is more of a question. Can I ask kind of what they think of the role of the private rented sector in the north? Would that help to move things forward? Because I think we are also seeing in London, whilst there is a culture of home ownership and encouraging home ownership, and I think Brandon Lewis would say that neighbourhood planning instills in people, from his perspective, more of a bias towards positive planning for housing. But we're also seeing for young professionals with more mobility in their work, wanting to rent, move on, move abroad, come back. So maybe home ownership isn't a solution for them.
Okay, one at the back.
Marlowe from 24 Hours Magazine. This is in the manifesto about giving flexibility to local authorities around the north, but in the Housing and Planning Act, the government basically tried to stamp that out as much as possible. With that in mind, how does the panel feel the Housing and Planning Act regulations and stuff will work with this plan for the north?
Okay. The first one, thoughts around take-up of community land trusts and the role that they might play?
I think Simon, you made the point well made. I think diversity in what we do is a good check and a balance, as well as makes for a more vibrant and interesting, frankly, way forwards. I think what we do need to do, and I guess this comes back to this kind of need for something at scale, because at scale you can find proper space for the diversity within that. All too often things like CLTs get a bit squashed in the rush as the big boys kind of stick their elbows out and charge into a development scheme, and just the way the system works. So I think with that time and space to think properly, very taken with things like, you can tell by my accent from Scotland, but the old Scottish structure plans that just gave that kind of broad indicative way of how housing and economic development was going to go, and you then encourage the debate and put together how you actually achieve that kind of aspiration I think is absolutely a great model to look at for the north of England, and it will actually provide space and comfort and a safe space for CLTs et al. Within that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, fully on board with CLTs, and I completely agree with the point you made, and I think having giving more powers to cities and regions to join up would allow actually more land to be given over to CLTs actually, and that should be a really key part of the mix there. So yeah.
Okay.
I was at a round table earlier in the week in London on empty homes and how we can bring those back into use across the north, and we were thinking about the CLT model and co-housing and the £60 million a year for 5 years fund, which is a potentially huge opportunity. But one of the issues that was raised in that conversation was perhaps the unhelpfulness in some occasions between a community-led organisation and a community-based organisation, and perhaps we need some flexibility on that definition to enable more organisations to take advantage of that funding. But I do think, you know, it's £60 million a year over that time frame is something that, you know, there are northern parts of the country that should benefit from that fund, definitely.
Okay, a question around consultation, councillors, training. Would better training help planning committees make better decisions and help unblock the sort of the logjam and the housing crisis?
Yeah, I smiled when he said that. I always remember as my first job as chairman of the planning committee, within 5 minutes we agreed a conservation area in a part of the city, and then the leader of the council approved a planning application for some bloody horrible plastic windows bang in the middle of the conservation area 5 minutes after approving it. So that kind of resonates. Was it the councillor's fault? I think no. Actually, I think it was the fault of the planning system to create the understanding why we were doing what we were trying to achieve through the creation of that. So I think actually one of the things that we do need is a braver, bolder, more innovative, more widely supported and highly regarded planning system in this country. I think for far too long it's been stamped on and denuded of talent. And kind of had that aspiration stripped from it, getting our planning system back to kind of what I would call it, beyond older than I, but the good old days of sort of the Abercrombies and this grand project, the grand city planning, where we can actually talk about the use of space properly and do that kind of system of planning properly. That is a skill that has sadly been lost. And I think to then expect councillors to stand up for something when that is kind of, that support isn't really, if I'm honest, there. I think it's a two-way street on that one, and I think there needs to be that mutuality of understanding what we're doing. And again, it comes back again also, I think, to the nature of planning. It's very reactive. You know, the drawing's already done, the consultation's already started, you put it up and try and knock it down. Actually, we need to be much earlier in that process and have that kind of co-creation of a planning system, co-creation of a regeneration plan, whether that be for your city or town or for the north of England. I think it refers to all those spatial levels.
Yeah, I was just going to on the PRS point. I think that's really really important in terms of attracting young graduates, retaining young graduates, and attracting people to northern cities. I think the interesting thing would be to think about what kind of tenures could be introduced that allow people to transition from private renting to owning, or to at least build up some kind of equity stake while they're renting.
Absolutely.
If you have a good quality, affordable PRS, and you're also offering means into home ownership through that, then I think the North stands to compete much better than it can currently with the South.
Yeah, and I think on that, the rent-to-buy model that lots of consortium members are operating as a market rent model, if you link that to Help to Buy ISAs, do provide a route through to home ownership. The other thing on the private rented sector, I think that's started to come through in recent years. New Economy in Manchester did some work looking at the PRS across Manchester and what people's aspirations were and why they were choosing to live in different parts of Manchester. And they found there's, as you know from Manchester, was a high concentration of private rented sector in city centres, very much that graduate, postgraduate, young professionals, but increasingly they were seeing a demand for young families perhaps moving into the suburbs who were wanting to live in particular localities, perhaps because the educational offer there was very good, but they couldn't afford home ownership. And there was a gap in the market for a good quality private rented sector model. One of the commissioners who's working with us, Philip Whitehead, is a regional director for Countryside Homes, and they've actually started to develop exactly that sort of high quality PRS product that works within a suburban setting for families. And what's interesting, I think, in some of that is that as you see institutional investment come in, some of those institutional investors have a different sort of drive on their yield expectation. Some of the current suite of investors into the private rented sector effectively operate on a churn basis. They need turnover in stock because that's where they increase rents and drive profit. Some of the longer term institutional investors are not driven by churn, and perhaps that gives a more stable, high quality PRS offer for a wider marketplace.
I do think one of the problems we do have, though, is that to get pre-PRS working in a proper scale, it relies on certainty of income. And the volatility in the market is something that just detracts. So I think a couple of things we could do, certainly across the north, but certainly for government, is actually to try and bring some reasoned information and some proper data to look at how PRS actually works, to bring certainty for investors coming into PRS. Second thing we should do is just actually look at new models. Why do we expect something that's not worked to date, just simply by repeating it ad nauseum, to then suddenly work? That doesn't always follow. So I think creating new models to create that certainty for investors. So things, and forgive me for blowing our own trumpet, but look at the flexi rent scheme that Home Group have developed, which actually guarantees revenue income for a PRS investor against a private rented scheme. I think it's kind of making new markets for investors are some of the things we should be doing, alongside creating new kinds of PRS housing. At the moment, it's still a bit one size fits all. It needs to understand its market, whether it's graduates, whether it's stuff. We're doing some work on rock and roll housing for over 60s, really, which is brilliant because I'm almost there, sadly. I don't want to go into an elderly person's sheltered housing scheme. I'm rock and roll. It's about understanding your market and starting to build against that market and that market sector. And again, we're still very one size fits all in this country.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes to go, so this might be the last question that we can put. We'll see how we do. The affordability recommendation, which reads, give flexibility to localities on affordable housing and starter home targets to kickstart regeneration. Can you, if it's known, can you elaborate on that? Do you mean put them up or take them down, or flexible either way? And then how would that fit into law, into the structures that we've got?
Well, I guess the easiest way to sort of think about that is that it links in with cities and regions working together in partnerships where they can kind of determine the right mix through that partnership. But in some areas just don't need to have a certain mix of affordable housing, and other areas need a different mix. So it's just about ensuring.
Could one area that has to have 30% at the moment, could they have 100% or zero? Is that what you mean, flexible either way?
Yeah. So
that could be used against the sort of access to affordability if it's removed, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, okay. I guess the key thing there is the thing, in city centre developments in Manchester, you may have different affordability targets than you do in Hartlepool. Can there be some kind of rebalancing of that so that you don't, in Hartlepool, have to be delivering certain types of housing that aren't necessarily responsive to the local market needs?
Right. Would you need new laws and new bills and new acts to do that?
That's a very good question. I suspect you would, but I think that's the kind of a northern powerhouse approach to housing that we don't currently have. So I think that's why it's a northern powerhouse recommendation.
Okay. Any other thoughts on affordability and the law?
Sorry, Charlotte. And I guess sometimes we confuse what we would genuinely mean by affordability. We kind of sometimes tie affordability to rent as well. Affordability, I think, cuts across all tenures. So I think this comes back to understand your market and don't understand your market within a very small area, because then you create distortions of the like you absolutely you talk about there. If you understand it at a great enough scale, then I think there's scope to bring the appropriate kind of tenure at the appropriate kind of cost. And maybe there's some kind of deal that housing associations, local authorities, developers, PRS developers can bring, which actually takes people in a graduated way, because your life changes over the period of your life. Why should you have to move house or move tenure simply because you're more or less affluent over the period of your life? So what could we start to offer then as a sort of a flexible kind of tenure and a flexible kind of affordability to provide a home for life? Or at least until you get to 60.
Just allow the planners, the quasi-lawyers that have to get these applications through, doesn't that allow them all sorts of flexibility with the terming and the interpretation of that can be argued to support whatever their developer client wants to do?
I guess one runs the risk of that, but I think the principle of flexibility, but flexibility done right, is something I would very much support. The how you control and how you govern the done right bit of it, I guess, is a bigger and longer question that we can't do in a couple of minutes. But with that caveat, I think absolutely flexibility should be given.
And it might be that, coming back to the Housing and Planning Act, obviously we were expecting further regulations to come through on that, particularly around pay to stay, for example, for local authorities. Pay to stay is voluntary for RPs, but that might, I think, beyond the sort of current definition of pay to stay, but that might be the start of a discussion about flexible rent that moves around affordability in exactly the way that Mark's mentioning.
Okay, time for one or two final remarks if anybody wants to put a point. No? Okay, one closing remark.
Picking up on the neighbourhood planning, CPR are advocates of it in terms of bringing decision making down to local community structures. In rural areas, they're taking things slow and we've got parish structures and no forum. In urban areas, it's really tricky to understand who's responsible. Organising a neighbourhood forum is really complex. I think government could help by providing skills and funding. It talks about planning, but it doesn't seem to deliver an actually empowering the process of planning.
Okay, covered a lot of ground there, didn't we, within 60 minutes or so. Join me in thanking our panellists. Thank you.